Austin Root is here for you, your favorite Australia guy. Perth has no traffic jams worth mentioning, houses that are still semi-affordable, and sits 4,000 kilometers closer to Asia than Sydney. Yet most Australians and nearly all international observers act like it doesn't exist as an economic force. The gap between what Perth actually is and what people think it is might be the most obvious underestimation in the developed world right now, and that's about to shift. But wait! Before we begin, please subscribe to ensure that you never miss out on any of my essential stuff. Comment "I subscribe" below, and I will personally welcome you to our community. With that said, let's get started. Here's the thing that almost no one talking about Australia mentions. Western Australia accounts for 43% of Australia's total exports. 43%, one state. Most people assume Sydney or Melbourne do that because they're the visible capitals. They're not. WA's resources sector generated $220 billion in sales in 2025 alone. Iron ore was $122 billion of that from 897 million tons of production, making WA basically the world's supply line for the steel that builds everything. And that's before you count lithium. Australia produces roughly 50% of the world's mined lithium supply. Most of it comes out of Western Australia. Your EV battery, your phone, the grid scale storage, keeping the lights on in half. The developed world, it depends on mines and processing facilities concentrated in a state with fewer people than New York City. Lithium prices have gyrated wildly over the past few years, but the long-term direction is clear. As the world transitions to renewables and electrified transport, demand for lithium doesn't decline. It accelerates, and the geographic advantage doesn't move, it stays in WA. But here's where it gets more interesting. This isn't just about mining as it existed 10 years ago. It's about mining as it's being reorganized for the new energy economy. Perth is 4,000 kilometers closer to Asia than Sydney. That's not poetic, that's logistics. Freight times matter, port access matters. And right now, WA is scaling infrastructure specifically to lock in that advantage. The Westport Authority, launched in 2026, is a $204 million investment in modernizing Perth and Fremantle's port capacity. The Dampier Link Bridge, completed, recently connects shipping infrastructure to enable faster cargo handling. Perth Airport is undergoing the largest infrastructure upgrade in the state's history to become, as officials put it, a gateway to the Indo-Pacific. This isn't fantasy or aspirational talk. This is capital allocation by governments and private companies acting on a simple fact. The global economy is shifting toward Asia and the Indo-Pacific. Europe knows it, the US knows it, Australia knows it, and the logical place for Australian goods to reach those markets fastest is from WA's ports, not from the East Coast. Companies aren't just noticing this on paper, they're moving. Data centers are being built in Perth specifically to serve APAC markets. Investment in tech infrastructure is accelerating. Startups are relocating from Melbourne. The startup ecosystem in Perth has grown noticeably, not because Perth became trendy, but because the math of proximity and lower operating costs suddenly made sense. And then something else started happening. Perth recorded the fastest population growth of any Australian capital in recent years. Not Brisbane, not Sydney, Perth. Why? Because Sydney and Melbourne became too expensive for too many people, and there are only so many times you can downsize or move to the suburbs before you realize you could move to a completely different city and live better. In 2026, Sydney's property market flatlined. Melbourne declined, but Perth up 10% or more, according to Reiwa forecasts. In January alone, the month-over-month growth was 2%, quarterly growth 7%. The inventory of homes for sale dropped 30% year over year. That's a market with fundamental supply-demand friction, not speculation. And here's what makes it interesting. Rather than just another property boom, the prices still make sense. A median house in Sydney costs about 5% more than the same house in Perth. For that same money, in Perth you get more space, a shorter commute, cheaper rent if you're not buying, and a genuinely different quality of life. That's not a minor difference. It's a reframing of what Australian life can cost. Younger families and investors who miss Sydney's run are looking west. Not because Perth is the next Sydney, it isn't, but because Perth is becoming the place where the trade-off between price and access actually works. You get a major city, modern infrastructure, growing job market, and you're not locked out by $1.5 million median prices. But that property boom isn't the whole story. The cost of living in Perth is measurably lower. Groceries run about 4% cheaper than Sydney. Restaurant prices are comparable or lower. Rent is significantly lower. Public transport works. The city has space. These aren't small factors. If you're actually living there, they compound over years. And here's the part that matters for thinking about the future. These advantages aren't temporary, they're structural. Perth isn't cheap because it's undeveloped. It's cheaper because it has fewer people competing for the same resources, because land is more available, and because the property market hasn't been financialized to the same extent. It's not a bubble waiting to pop. It's a repricing toward reality. Meanwhile, WA's economy continues to do something Sydney and Melbourne can't: grow faster than the national average. In 2025, WA's domestic economy grew 3.3%. National growth was 2.5%. That gap isn't an accident. It's because the resources sector is generating actual wealth, not just property appreciation, but revenue, exports, and jobs. And 46% of WA's electricity grid came from renewables in Q1 2026. That matters because it means the energy-intensive industries that might expand in WA in the next decade, data centers, processing facilities, battery manufacturing, critical minerals refining, will have access to increasingly cheap, clean power. That makes Perth competitive in ways it wasn't before. But the real question is, how long can Perth stay underrated? There's a pattern in how cities are noticed. First, people overlook them because they're distant or seem inconsequential. Then, if the numbers are actually good, there's a moment when the gap between reality and perception snaps shut, usually all at once. You see it happen with cities frequently. Vienna becomes desirable, certain Asian cities suddenly matter, Australian regional centers shift from sleepy to sought after. Perth is in that gap right now. The economic fundamentals are genuinely strong. The infrastructure is being built. The population is moving there. The global context, Asia's growth, the energy transition, supply chain diversification, all favors a city with Perth's position. But the world hasn't caught up to the fact that Perth is serious. How long that gap lasts is the question. Some people will move to Perth before it's obvious why. Some will move after and pay more for the privilege of being late. Some will dismiss it forever and be wrong. But the physics of the situation, resources, geography, infrastructure, timing, suggest that Perth's moment isn't a decade away. It might be happening now. The interesting part is watching whether Perth stays a story about mining and affordability, or whether it becomes a story about a major city that actually works. Different people will see that differently. So here's what I want to know. Do you think Perth's rise is real, a genuine shift in Australia's economic geography, or is this a property bubble that'll deflate? And if you had to move tomorrow, would Perth be on your list? Or does the idea of being that far from the East Coast feel like too much of a gamble?